the environment is one of the key motivations.
Yep. So, yeah, good afternoon. And my name's Irene McMaster, and I work here at EPRC. And I'd like to welcome you to this seminar, which is part of a series of seminars which does usually take place on a face-to-face basis and at our base at the University of Strathclyde, and we can usually tempt people with sandwiches and a lunch, which is good. We'll hopefully be able to get back to that in the future. But the series is now an active online series of events that we've been running over the last sort of 18 months. And I'm really delighted to welcome Gail Hurley and Jonathan Glennie, who will be here to sort of discuss the research and findings of work that they've been doing in relation to lessons for global development finance from EU funds. And I mean, particularly from the EPRC point of view, it's interesting to get a view of cohesion policy from a slightly different angle, because we are so involved in working on it on a nuts and bolts day-to-day basis. So it's interesting to see how it's viewed from a different perspective. As is usual, the presentation will be about 30 minutes, and in the remaining time we can open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. And if you'd like to make an intervention, there's the Zoom raised hand function, or feel free to put comments in the chat function, and we can pick them up in the Q&A at the end. Also, just before introducing the speakers, it's just to let you know, as Liliana has just said, the meeting's being recorded, which means that there's the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage or share the recording, as it will be made available on our YouTube channel, and that link will be sent out to you via email. And also feel free to sort of tweet and do all that kind of stuff about the webinar as well. So just to introduce our speakers today, we have Gail Hurley, who's a senior researcher and advisor on development finance, and has worked with various UN agencies, philanthropic foundations, NGOs, working to sort of develop high quality analytical work and data on analysis of financial flows and how they are supporting international development efforts. And she's currently a fellow with development initiatives and serves on expert working groups on global public investment and ethical finance. And it's also Jonathan Glennie, who's a writer, researcher and consultant on sustainable development and inequality and poverty. And his work looks in particular at the changing nature of international cooperation as sort of paradigms shift and global economic relationships evolve, particularly with all the change that's going on at the moment. And he's held senior positions in several international organisations, including Save the Children and Christian Aid, and interestingly has also just published a book on the future of aid and global public investment, which was published by Routledge last year. So he's obviously been busy over the lockdown period as well. So having said all of that and done the introductions, I'll hand over first to Gail and to pass on then to Jonathan. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Irene, for the warm welcome and the introduction. A very good afternoon to all of you, and big thanks to the University of Strathclyde for the invitation to join you all this afternoon. I hope to be able to join you in person in the not too distant future, Irene, for one of your in-person seminars at Strathclyde. So let's hope we can pencil that in for 2022. So as mentioned by Irene, myself and Jonathan are independent researchers, writers and advisors on development finance. I spent many years working with the United Nations on this topic in New York. Jonathan has a long career with civil society organizations working on this topic. We are both coming at this issue from an international development background. So not at all from the perspective of those who are engaged in the intricacies of the EU funds, as mentioned by Irene. And I think that's one of the interesting things about this research, is our attempt and our view to try to break down the silos between those looking at the EU funds and those also working on aid policy and aid practice from an international development perspective. I'm based in Edinburgh, so not too far from many of you. Jonathan is normally based in Bogota, but is in London at the moment. We've worked together for many years on a variety of research papers and projects. Our focus is very much on international aid and the international aid architecture and its fitness for the 21st century, and very much thinking about, well, look, our current aid system was founded in the aftermath of World War II, over 60 years ago now, very much centered on voluntary contributions, voluntary aid flows from supposed wealthy or developed countries to poorer nations. We ask whether that paradigm is still valid today in a context in which there are shifting, very rapidly shifting economic and political dynamics between countries, and also in a context in which the range of challenges we need international public finance to address is expanding, not least, of course, the need to urgently mobilize financing for climate change adaptation and mitigation, which for those of you based in Scotland, of course, was difficult to escape over the last couple of weeks with Glasgow hosting COP26. So as Irene mentioned, I mean, Jonathan and I have written several research papers which outline sort of our vision for a more effective international aid architecture fit for the 21st century. Jonathan's recently published a book which goes much more into detail on this topic if it's of interest, and he would be very upset with me if I didn't plug his excellent book. Which, well,
apart from anything else, you wrote half of it, Gail, so
well, not quite.
That's worth remembering. The best half.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. But anyway, if you would like to put that in somebody's stocking for Christmas, it's called The Future of Aid, Global Public Investment, published by Routledge. So please take a look. And Jonathan and I are also very active in a global working group, expert working group, which is also looking at this topic, specifically how we reform international public finance systems to make them fit for the 21st century. It is the Global Public Investment Working Group. We have a variety of experts from a variety of disciplines join us on that group, and you can please take a look at some of the work that we've been done and are consulting on at globalpublicinvestment.org, and you are very much warmly invited to look at that paper and send us any thoughts you have on it. That is also a work in progress as well. But anyway, that's just by sort of way of quick background into some of the things that we've been engaged in recently. But on this paper more specifically, sort of in the context of our broader work on reforming ODA, official development assistance, and sort of the international aid architecture, we started to look at the EU's internal aid programme, specifically the EU structural and cohesion funds. And we started looking at sort of the types of financial instruments they were using internally, the types of interventions that they were funding. But crucially, I think for us in the international development aid world, the language or narrative that is being used to describe the vision for and the objectives around the EU structural and cohesion funds. For us, I think in the international development aid world, we often hear, oh, countries are getting richer. You know, I spoke earlier about, you know, aid was originally conceived as a tool to provide stopgap financing from rich to poor that should come to an end when countries you know, reach a certain level of development or income. And of course, as many countries become middle or even upper middle income status over recent years, many sort of policymakers in the international aid world have been saying, well, now aid can come to an end. And we wanted to sort of, you know, we were concerned about that. We didn't buy that narrative. And we sort of wanted to look more closely at the validity of that. And, you know, it was very illuminating to us to look at how the narrative around how aid can be useful in higher income countries was portrayed within the EU structural and cohesion funds. But I think overall for us, we found that there is a big gap in the literature. Basically, no one views the literatures on EU structural and cohesion funds in the same breath as the literature on international aid flows, even though those two types of aid, if you like, really are confronting many of the same issues and challenges, but they're never looked together. We're not here to comment overall, I should say, on the effectiveness of EU structural and cohesion funds. We're not here to comment on the overall effectiveness of official development assistance. Our very pragmatic view on that, I think, is that when it comes to any kind of aid flow, you'll have great examples and you'll have terrible examples, aid that works and aid that doesn't work. So it's not necessarily to get into does it work kind of debates, but you know, it's to seek to understand from our point of view what the EU structural and cohesion programs might be able to tell us in terms of how we might want to reimagine the future international aid architecture. And we were fortunate enough to get some financing from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that enabled us to dig a bit deeper and go with our hunches. Is there something to look at here? And do some of this preliminary research. So thanks to them, we came up with 9 lessons learned from EU funds for global development finance. And perhaps today's conversation, we can come up with a 10th or 11th and 12th. Certainly, this work still very much remains an area of inquiry that we are interested in progressing even further. So we'd love to, you know, present the work, get your perspectives on it. We've had a consultation with those from within the global development community on the findings. Irene was part of that, so thanks for joining that. But we'd love to hear perspectives from those that, you know, come at it from a very different angle as well, and that's part of the objective of today's conversation as well. So our view overall, and I'll finish very quickly now, is that EU structural and cohesion funds and the world of ODA should not necessarily be seen as very distinct and different fields of research and inquiry, but that there should be cross-fertilization across experts and practitioners that are part of both communities. We believe that both are still very much operating in silos. We believe this area of inquiry has been made perhaps even more important in the context of post-COVID-19 recovery, where governments around the world are shrinking domestic public finance budgets and international public finance budgets there. So thinking about how we can make every public finance dollar count is really more important than ever before. Before I hand over to Jonathan, who's going to go through the 9 lessons, I should say that in our 9 lessons, some of those are relevant to how specific projects could be made more effective. So they're very much at the micro level, if you like. And others, we also thought about, well, what is governance and decision making when it comes to EU funds? You know, what does those decision-making practices also tell us for how decision-making on international aid, how that might change and be improved as well? So that will be at the very macro level. So we do kind of look at both elements in the work as well. So without further ado, let me pass over to Jonathan to directly contradict everything I just said and provide an overview of the 9 lessons. And then we end with a couple of questions that we'd love to back to you for a Q&A, and any other questions or perspectives that you would like to share. We'd love to hear from you. So over to you, Jonathan.
Hey, thanks very much, Gail. So yeah, in about 2014, Gail said to me, we should look at how EU funds kind of relate to international development. And I'd never really thought of that. And I don't think anyone really thought of it either, because there was nothing on it. I mean, and this is one of the points, I guess, of this meeting and other meetings we want to do around this paper eventually when it comes out, is just to see if there is stuff that we haven't come across. So for this paper, we did a bit of, so we wrote this piece. I just looked it up, Gail, it was in 2014. That's so long ago. And, you know, just the beginnings of a piece, and exactly what Gail just said. You know, we finally got money to actually do a deeper dive. And so we did a literature review. And there is some, of course, there's some stuff, but it's really limited. And I'd be really interested to hear from people on this call if that is broadly right. So this first slide, before I come on to the 9 kind of lessons that we drew, is just kind of a list of the various things, not even all of them, just some of the various things that are really important parts of both literatures. So Gail and I are really knowledgeable about the international development literature, and these issues come up endlessly. And then when we started to look at the EU literature, which we're far less knowledgeable about, and we were just kind of doing this beginning scoping, again, these issues these issues and many more come up endlessly. And so we just started thinking, yeah, we're basically right. I mean, there are these 2 literatures, 2 analyses, 2 kind of worlds of practice and theory and analysis that are not really joining up very much at all. And when you look at the papers, certainly the papers the papers we've read or we know about on international development, I would say I can't think of a single reference there's ever been to the EU funds, structural funds. And looking at the papers we just read for this paper on the EU structural funds, there were 1 or 2 mentions maybe of broader international development funds. But so that's just to make the point, there's a really, really understudied issue, but we think a huge one, partly because, and this is the book I wrote that Gail really wrote with me, but then kind of had to move house and stuff. I can't really and stuff like that. But you know, partly that's because we're proposing a way of thinking about the future of international aid that does draw a lot of lessons and can learn a lot from the way that Europe has done it. And not just Europe, by the way, Africa also has a fairly well thought through system, far less, I hesitate to use the word developed, it's really annoying, but far less structured and developed than the EU has. But it's not just the EU that does this. So what are our kind of lessons from looking at what might the lessons be for international cooperation, having looked at the way the EU does stuff? Some of them are quite kind of radical, some of them are just kind of, I guess, tweaks and learning. So this is the first one, concessional support for countries at all income levels. So one of the, I guess, fundamentals of international development aid is that as countries become wealthier, they, quotes, graduate from aid. And that, generally speaking, happens in the kind of lower middle income area, and it's not something that happens in the same way in the EU. There is a kind of shift from net recipient status to net contributor status, and there are also categorizations of countries, but fundamentally the countries, and this is maybe the major point, countries that receive EU structural funds are really, really wealthy countries. So I think there's a huge error in international development thinking, which confuses the fact that it's politically difficult to do something with the fact that there's no need for something. So you'll hear again and again, oh, well, Ghana doesn't need grant support anymore because it's over this random and incredibly stingy threshold that was invented by the World Bank 40 years ago. Vietnam doesn't need grant support anymore. And then eventually it will say, and so we'll have concessional loans. And it doesn't need concessional loans anymore. It will have non-concessional loans. But that concept of need is very political. You know, does Poland need grant support? It certainly gets a hell of a lot. When I looked last, it was like 5 billion over a period of years. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head. Did Spain need grant support for the last 40 years as a member of the EU? It certainly received a hell of a lot. Did Ireland need it? Well, I guess the point here is to question the idea that grant support is only really useful for the very poorest countries. The EU challenges that. There is no clear end point. And the aim is, crucially, not to overcome a simple poverty line, which is the point of aid. And you will hear senior aid people say this country no longer requires international development support because it is bam over this line. Whereas the point of the EU, and this is absolutely clear from a fascinating document that is the kind of more work, at least as the basis of all of this in the 70s. I forget his name, was a Scottish guy, I think, certainly a Scottish name. By the way, I'm Scottish, and I wanted to get that out. I'm from Aberdeen. Well, my great grandfather was from Aberdeen, but in parenthesis. So the point has always been convergence, not, quote, ending extreme poverty. So that's a huge difference. Number two, grants, not loans. Similarly, there's a lot of overlap between some of these lessons. ODA recipients are expected to graduate from grants to loans, but almost all, everything I'm saying is in parenthesis, please correct me if I'm wrong, but almost all EU structural funds are grants, and there are so-called financial instruments, which are basically loans, but it's still a very small proportion, and equity is an even tinier proportion of EU funds, just as it is in ODA. They're growing, there's a lot of interest in it, but the idea that, again, very wealthy countries relatively to the rest of the world, like south of Italy, like the south of Europe, like Eastern Europe, can't benefit from grants and must receive loans, which is basically the mantra for the rest of the world when we talk about international development aid, simply not the case within the EU. Third, net contributors also benefit directly. This is fascinating, a huge difference. The whole aid setup is, here are the donors, here are the recipients, kind of never the twain shall meet, although of course we know that increasingly most countries in the world are actually both donors and recipients. So I live in Colombia, and Colombia has an aid agency or a cooperation agency. One directorate is called receipts and another directorate is called contributions, because that is the reality of many, many countries around the world nowadays. Most obviously, China still receives large amounts of development cooperation, so does India, as well as being huge contributors to development cooperation. Nevertheless, the theory, certainly from the West, is we are contributors, others are recipients. In the EU, net contributors like Germany, France, the wealthier countries, also receive support. This is for things that the EU considers to be important: marginalized groups, sustainable transport, small and middle SMEs. So that begs the question, and this is the question I want to ask to international people working in international cooperation: why not just organize a system where Germany gives less to the pot? Why would it put money into the pot and then receive money back? It's actually a quite fascinating question, and it opens up the question of what is the special nature of international public funding. It's not just, obviously, simply a capital transfer, a transfer of cash. Because if it was just a transfer of cash, you just reduce Germany's contribution. But it's actually much more than that. It builds a coherent overall approach. International money follows different accountability, in this case, accountability to a Brussels-led or a Europe-wide led set of objectives. It also is intended to, it didn't work too well in the case of the UK, but it was intended to build political support for the overall system in net contributor countries, and that's clear from the early documents. So why can't we think about that at an international level, rather than continuing to think about some countries are donors, some countries are recipients? Start to think about all countries being contributors, even the poorest, such as Romania, and all countries being all countries being recipients, even the richest, such as Germany, and all countries being contributors, such as the poorest, like Romania and others. So that is a totally different way of doing things. It's actually the heart of this new global public investment concept that we're putting forward. Mutual benefit is central to the narrative. All countries benefit from the funds, not just direct recipients. So you don't just benefit directly, you benefit from healthier, wealthier neighbors. Now that's part of the ODA and the aid narrative sometimes. It's certainly very clearly there in the South-South cooperation narrative, but it's not a forceful part of the ODA narrative, which is much more built on let's help others. But what you find is that, you know, the global South is immensely tired of being told that it's in desperate need of help from the generous North, probably a narrative which is far from true anyway. So the language of mutual benefit, all working to create a region, in the case of the EU, that is healthier and wealthier, and from which everyone benefits, is a far less patronizing narrative. And it's one that we think really should be the basis of future international cooperation, rather than continuing to separate out these kind of, you know, basically basing it around charity. Related to point one, ending poverty is just the start. And there is very little extreme poverty in the European Union, but that has not led to less interest in large-scale grants. There's a famous, not famous, but a quote that I love by a guy who used to run German aid, a guy called Adolf Klokerlesch, who said, development only really begins when poverty is eradicated. And that turns on its head the stuff that is much more common in the sector that Gail and I work in, which is to say the point of development is to eradicate poverty. And when that's done, it's kind of everyone reduce, let's all go. Look at where I live in Colombia, people are walking off, you know, because it's very hard to get development cooperation, very concessional development cooperation for Colombia, because that, you know, there's very little extreme poverty as decided by a random calculation. And with the conflict supposedly coming to some kind of end, although it hasn't in 2016, donors find it hard to send money there because that's not the point. But in fact, the EU says something quite different: business and jobs, innovation and research, infrastructure, marginalized communities, culture. There's just an endless range of things that international public money can support. Interestingly, not public services, which are considered to be a national responsibility. And there's very little money, as I understand it, to support public health and public education and those kind of things, which actually in the world of international development, certainly from the West, certainly from the DAC donors, the OECD donors, has been a huge part of, at least of the last 20, 30 years, the majority of aid money. So that's a huge difference. Membership, again, membership model, not donor and recipient. So joint decision making on priorities and strategies. So the implication of all countries being contributors and all countries being recipients, but mostly all countries being contributors, is that there is joint decision making. So in one paper I read, it was described as one big argument every 7 years about the overall strategy. And then obviously there are the continuous discussions about how exactly the budget is organized. You can't get away from the fact that, you know, the big countries are the big countries. And, you know, they're not, you know, going to fight it out. Germany's not going to fight it out with San Marino. But you do build up an institution that and laws and norms that somewhat mitigate that. So even the smallest countries are at the table to discuss priorities, etc., etc. Why can't a system like that be considered at the international level, or does it depend on the tight kind of political union that the European Union has? And I think that's a really good question. And clearly, I think what Gail and I are suggesting is not European Union writ large at a global level. I don't think anyone would think that would work. But there are lessons and questions that need to be asked. And in my view, we can consider a kind of joint decision making. And in fact, it wouldn't only be more legitimate in the world of international aid, it would actually be more effective. And COVID is the most latest but incredibly obvious example. So decisions made about spending on global health and vaccines have been taken by the wealthy nations. And look at the consequences. And not only for the poorest nations who are struggling to get vaccines, but also actually for the world, because COVID continues to run rampant as long as many countries haven't got it under control. So those decisions would have been different in a different model. In Europe, enhanced democratic oversight, so European Parliament's involved. There's a partnership principle involving non-state actors, and this thing called multi-level governance. There's efforts to have community-led local development and local action groups, and there is a formal complaint mechanism. None of these stuff, well, that's not quite true. Some of this exists to some extent in the world of international aid, but it's significantly more thought through in the European Union. And I think there's a lot to learn from the way that governments are and subnational and non-governmental actors are formally involved in decision making, not just as an afterthought. Innovations in co-financing. So receipts of EU funds are capped at 4%, although they're generally much less. And there is a strong focus on countries co-financing projects. Again, you know, this also exists at the international level. There are certainly huge amounts of lessons of what works and what doesn't work from the EU that ought to be being shared. And then finally, sub and supranational relationships. So this is really interesting. As I understand it, the EU is split up into 145 regions. Poorer regions in rich countries are poorer than richer regions of poor countries, as I read in one of the papers I was reading. So, and that's formally understood. And there are relationships, and I guess this is difficult, but there are relationships between the center of the EU in Brussels with cities and subnational governments at the subnational level. And that is something that I think is a really interesting model for international cooperation. So what you have, just to use the example of Colombia again, there are regions in Colombia that are far poorer than some regions of some poorer countries in Africa. Certainly, if you have a slightly more complex understanding of poverty than the simple $1 a day model. So couldn't international development look at regions rather than countries, as in subnational regions? And then the last point there, the third bullet, is about supranational relationships. So there is relationships on cross-border collaboration. Some countries working together, Southern Europe, maybe the Iberian Peninsula, maybe the Nordic countries. And there are special projects relating to the various sub-regions. And again, that's, I would say, still in its infancy in international development, but really needs to be beefed up. As you know, we talk about, you know, global public goods, but actually there's a hell of a lot of regional public goods and sub-regional public goods. So cross-border public goods, which are not global and not necessarily regional, but are countries grouping together. And that also is something that I think could be learned from the EU. I think that's it. These are the questions. So over to you, Gail.
Oh, thanks so much, Jonathan. I think that was a fantastic overview of some of the main findings from our paper. And I think it's important to emphasize that we didn't want to necessarily, paint a picture of the EU structure and cohesion funds as being a perfect solution. And far from it. We read an awful lot of critiques of both decision making and the effectiveness of funds. So decision making being far from perfect and still subject, as Jonathan was saying, that one big fight every 7 years, but a lot of political horse trading going on, which influences who gets what and what that's spent on, and the fairness of that, and a lot of question marks as regards the efficiency of in the way that some public some of the EU funds have been spent. But nevertheless, I think our plea is really very much to join up the literatures and to ask those working in this field whether do you share our view that there are mutual lessons learned from the EU funds for those working in international aid, and lessons learned for how we might think about making international aid more effective and responsive? What aspects of the EU aid model do you think might be most applicable at the international level? And as I said earlier in my introduction, maybe we tried to come up with a number 10, so it was a nice round number, but we came up with 9. But if there's a 10th, 11th and 12th, we'd love to hear from you. Please don't hesitate to ask us any questions about the research. It's a project that we would very much like to continue, and would be keen to work with those from outside our own comfort zone, I think is fair to say, Jonathan, isn't it? So definitely, if you're interested in this topic, do let us know. I think, a couple of elements I would want to add is that, our view has always been that international public finance, like international aid flows, like the EU funds, have certain specific characteristics which make them very special sources of money. Not all dollars are the same, and international aid flows, whether they're intra-EU or whether they're for quote unquote a developing country, they can support things that domestic governments would find very difficult to do, actually. And so, they can be used to finance those things. They can, be extended over a much longer term time horizon. They can potentially take more risk due to the accountability structures. So there's a variety of ways in which those funds can be used in ways that domestic governments might find it difficult to use domestic public money in those ways. And so, given those characteristics, it's very lamentable from our point of view that the international aid discourse is such that, when a country reaches a certain level of development, these monies should come to an end. We want to challenge that, narrative with this work. And, secondly, it is very widely recognized that decision-making on international aid is now, for all intents and purposes, obsolete. This old model of the OECD DAC donors deciding how much to give, how it's measured, what is defined as aid, what counts and what doesn't count, that is increasingly being scrutinized, and rightly so. And what we need is a new approaches to decision making that are much more inclusive around, who gets aid, how it's defined, how it's decided, what it's for. But, you know, those discussions are still, you know, very, unfortunately, very far off into the future. But anyway, we would love to hear from you. Thank you again, Irene, for inviting us, and let us know what you think or any questions you might have.
Great. Yes, I can invite any questions if anybody wants to put their hand up. I see people are now appearing no longer as black rectangles, but actual human beings as well. So hello. But yes, if there were any questions, do feel free. I see a non-virtual hand from Fiona there, so thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation, which I really enjoyed. I come at it from the angle of not knowing really very much at all about the international aid world, and I suppose one question that I would have, joking aside, is whether there are lessons in the other direction, because we had a brief foray in one project in looking at financial instruments, and saw that there was a much longer history and practice of using loan-based instruments in international development than there is in the EU, where it's comparatively recent and motivated by budgetary pressures and a range of other things. So that's something that would be an interesting comment on. I suppose on a more like general point is that I suppose I found your perspective on things a little bit sort of like rose tinted, having watched a number of budget negotiations, and without being overly cynical, I think you can regard EU cohesion policy really as a kind of a byproduct of the budget negotiations. Okay, it's got some administrative requirements tacked on, but it's basically as you pointed out, a kind of bun fight between net contributors and net beneficiaries. And looking at one or two of the lessons, for instance, in I think the first one, you talked about everybody benefiting from the funds. Now that wasn't always so. It wasn't the case that when the structural funds were first introduced, it was it was a more targeted policy, and it proved incredibly difficult to sort of like to deselect eligible regions. And I think you could argue that the kind of like the regional policy, the disadvantaged, promoting support for disadvantaged areas dimension has been reduced over time, and there's quite a limited correlation between disadvantage and financial allocations. And quite often what's really happening in the budget negotiations is a kind of reverse engineering of the criteria. And I think, Jonathan, you referred to sort of like random criteria for establishing levels of poverty. Well, I would say it's pretty much the same within the EU too. Sort of like there are plenty of random and opaque criteria used there to establish what should be what should be allocated. So I mean, I think that there may well be lessons to be learned, but well, first of all, I think they might also come in the other direction. And secondly, I would be a bit more cynical about whether the kind of horse trading budgetary negotiations that go on yield sort of lessons for another area of policy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Fiona. I'm happy to give a first stab at responding to Fiona on lessons learned in the other direction. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. The international aid industry has made much more use of loan financing. And in particular, over recent years, over the last decade or so, we've seen a much bigger focus, many aid agencies expanding their blended finance work. So, you know, using aid, using grants, using guarantees to try to adjust the risk return profile of certain investments in the developing world to crowd in private investment, which would otherwise consider the investment too risky. So use of blended finance instruments, I would say, has really mushroomed over recent years in development finance. And the EU has also put an awful lot of extra cash in this direction through its EFSD plus, EFSD, then EFSD plus instrument, European Fund for Sustainable Development. They have their guarantee and blending facilities. Over 1 billion is being put into those instruments over the next budget cycle, specifically to support blended finance approaches in developing countries. Now, the aid, international aid literature, development literature as a whole, is replete with both praise and criticism for this type of approach. And in particular, how, yes, it might be useful in certain sectors like renewable energy, where, you know, future revenues might be more assured, where markets are more mature, the risk return profile clearer, but the model is being rolled out more broadly to other sectors and other areas where it might be less appropriate, including healthcare, for example. And it's interesting you saying, Fiona, that, you know, the EU might look at this more closely in the context of budget cuts due to COVID and that kind of thing, and whether the EU at a domestic level, an internal market level, might be increasingly interested in this kind of approach. I think another challenge has been with blended finance that, you know, it has been used much more in the emerging markets, so the higher income, larger economies of the developing world. And, you know, it has not really been as useful to the lower income countries, or, you know, it has not been used that much so far. So that has been another concern that's sort of been raised by the international development community as well, that, you know, it risks marginalizing those that are already marginalized when it comes to development financing. On your second point on sort of, you would have a more cynical approach with regard to decision making and do we put a rose-tinted lens on it? I mean, please, you know, we are here to speak to those who have more expertise on all of this, and we would love in future iterations of this work to be much more engaged with people like you and Irene and others on this call and in the broader community, to, if there is an interest in cross-fertilization on both sides, to have those difficult conversations about, you know, where the real lessons learned might lie and where, you know, continued challenges for decision making might mean that is something that we can strike off, perhaps. But Jonathan, I don't know if you want to add anything to Fiona's inputs.
No, just to agree with both of those. I totally agree. And it's not just the EU definitely has lessons to learn from the long literature of international cooperation finance. Another area is climate finance. I mean, it was frustrating to me to see climate finance be built up over the last, the concepts and the practice to be built up, and so much wheel reinvention going on. It was as if you know, the world of international aid didn't exist as environmentalists built a new system, which was great. You know, they did a great job in some of it, but yeah, the literature again was separate. So one of the main things that I'm totally clear on is that these literatures need to be begin to be looked at together. There is so much mutual learning to be had. And that's quite different, I guess, from the slightly more taking lessons to try and transform international aid, which is what I'm also trying to do with Gail. That's a slightly campaigny thing, whereas just the kind of academic, we need to learn from each other is, I think, quite clear. And then with regard to being cynical, yes, I mean, I think it's inevitable. We're aware that, I mean, most people we've spoken to have said something like that. You know, it doesn't work. There's all sorts of problems, and that's inevitable. But I'm kind of, I guess, quite at the same time as being quite ambitious for global structural reform. A lot of people would say, "Oh, this is just crazy ambitious." I'm actually quite unambitious in a way. I don't think that these kind of changes are going to make the world perfect at all. I think they probably would make it slightly better. So, and I think that about the EU as well. I mean, you know, for all its imperfections and for all those kind of, you know, mega struggles, you never get to a place which is anywhere near perfect in the world of human relations and international relations. But would it be somewhat better if we adopted some of those things at the international level? Well, I think, yeah, probably it would.
Thanks very much. Yeah, and I suppose with some of these lessons, it's what not to do and how to avoid copious amounts of bureaucracy and things, but take the good bits and yeah, carry them forward. But sometimes you learn from people who have learned the hard way most effectively. So talking of somebody who's learned the hard way, I noticed John's hand is up. So he's the director of the EPRC. So I'll hand over to him for a question.
Thanks very much, Gail and Jonathan. Yeah, I also found it quite interesting and sort of thought-provoking, particularly those coming from another field or literature, you know, in an area where you can get a bit fixated, is, I think, really helpful. I suppose I echo quite a lot of what Fiona said. I think I was going to use the word skeptical rather than cynical, but maybe that's just being a bit more diplomatic. In the sense that, you know, if you look at cohesion policy and how it's originated and developed, it's essentially, you know, there have been sort of mutual interests at stake and trade-offs between the sort of pace of European integration and the opening up of the building of the EU in terms of its sort of deepening and widening, and the way and the role of cohesion policy, which, you know, initially political scientists tended to be quite dismissive of, referring to it as a side payment. You know, if you go back to the literature in the early 1980s, but it does reflect, you know, that there are these mutual interests, if you like, at play, and of course, you know, particularly with cohesion policy, it's anchored in a treaty. It's anchored in the treaties in terms of an obligation to address, have a specific objective in terms of economic and social and territorial cohesion. I think also, you know, cohesion policy is, in some respects, is unrecognizable now from where it was in 1988, and it has evolved with different sort of layers of complexity. But I think, you know, there is a debate going on at the moment in the EU about the balance between what is referred to as shared management policies like cohesion policy and directly managed policies, and that latter form of intervention has been given a huge boost by the Recovery and Resilience Facility, Recovery and Resilience Fund, with a colossal amount of borrowing for the first time that is being used for directly transferring funds to member states in some respects a more simpler, well, in many respects in a simpler way than cohesion policy is managed, and that, I think, that has important implications for post 2027, which is the next bun fight for the 2028 plus period. You know, where you can already see the shape of the arguments starting to emerge. But I think in terms of, I mean, I know very little about development finance, but we have looked at it sometimes from the perspective of principal agent relationships, which seem to be far more complex within the EU and within EU cohesion policy. In terms of the transferability of lessons, first of all, from the EU outside, I mean, there has been a fair sort of industry over the last 20 years about lesson learning and exporting, in inverted commas, the EU practice in cohesion policy. And that's come particularly in countries in South America, where the interest has been particularly in the multi-level governance nature of the policy, and how it is able, or the questions have been asked about how useful it is in responding to widening disparities, which we've also seen in China, which is again a country which has had a lot of interest. And there've been a series of memoranda of agreement between the EU and countries like China, although I think it's, while there is a bit of a literature in this, it's really unclear to what extent there has been significant learning that has been able to be put into practice. I think it has contributed to the stock of knowledge, perhaps, rather than transfer. But the other interesting thing, and Fiona made this point about the transfer the other way, and Fiona talked about financial instruments, but about a decade ago, we did a study, and Martin Ferry isn't here, but Martin Ferry and I worked on a study for the European Commission, which was called EU Cohesion Policy in a Global Context, which is still available in the remoter corners of the DG Regio's InfoRegio site, where what the Commission wanted was to look at other countries that weren't outside the EU, that had multi-level systems, Canada, the US, Australia, Japan, but also international development institutions like the World Bank. And what I want to know is, well, do they manage their funds better in terms of particularly deliverability and accountability? And what we looked at there was use of grants and loans, but also conditionalities, sanctions and incentives, feedback mechanisms, reporting and so on, evaluation, but also the contracting methods, the funding agreements. And that was part of the debate that led to the use of conditionalities really intensifying from 2014 onwards as part of the 2012-2013 reform. So there's been a lot of borrowing, I think, in the EU, from particularly on conditionalities, sanctions, and incentives, which you might not recognise when you look at them in the EU context. But they're, the EU certainly has looked a lot at what it could learn from the relationships and how you can ensure that once you've given money, that there are still what kind of mechanisms there are available to ensure that the targets that are set are actually achieved without, all these concepts in the principal agent literature like slippage and drift and so on that there are. So I'm sort of very interested in the lessons you draw. I'm a little skeptical because of the distinctiveness of the EU system, but I think particularly focused on specific mechanisms or aspects of how aid is delivered and managed in the development context, and how funds are similarly managed and monitored in the EU context. I think there's a fair bit there to learn.
Oh, thanks so much, John. A really thoughtful contribution. You touched on so many issues. I couldn't possibly come back on them all. But if you're able to point us in the direction of that EU cohesion policy paper in a global context, I'm sure Jonathan and I would be really pleased to have a look at that. I think one of the issues is, what are the lessons learned, or both ways, in terms of, concretely, at the project level, which I concede the EU would be interested in speaking to the World Bank and aid agencies and other sort of like institutions, about, how it manages slippage and conditionalities, because those are all sort of operational side questions. And I think, but we are also interested, Jonathan and I, in, some of the bigger picture issues as well. Yes, of course, the micro aspects, but also the macro aspects in terms of decision making around where money goes and what it does and how it's delivered and how it's defined and all of that, in particular in a context in which we're seeing worrying trends in the aid narrative, both in terms of graduating countries and that whole middle income no longer needs it kind of argument, as well as graduating to only specific types of financial instrument, and the sort of continuing hold over the international aid architecture by really a very increasingly small set of donor countries. I mean, but our community is also very fixated, tunnel vision on them, sort of the technical details as well. So, it would be great to get our communities together more often, I think. And, you mentioned, John, that in cohesion policy, there's a treaty. And, there's not the equivalent when it comes to aid, but there is, in the sense that, so-called developed countries have committed under the UN General Assembly framework to allocate certain amounts of a certain percentage of their GNI on an annual basis for the purposes of economic development and human welfare. So, there are sort of the beginning rumblings of sort of international commitments, but of course that's not codified in any, and, there's no punishment really beyond publishing data on what they're doing and what doing to actually compel anyone to fulfill any of those UN commitments. But I'll stop there, and we would very much appreciate keeping in touch with you all and with Irene, with the centre, and discussing future opportunities for collaboration on this research agenda. I'm not sure, Jonathan, if you have anything to add on some of the many points that John raised.
No, it's fascinating to hear them, and I thought it was, usually what people say is the way that the EU does things won't work. That can more, I don't know, not collegial, you probably wouldn't like that word, but the more kind, basically everyone sat around a table rather than the donor recipient dichotomy. That kind of way wouldn't work in international arena because there are rules, there are, it's a members club. And without that kind of members club and regional closeness, that won't work. But it's fascinating to me, John. I didn't, what I understood from your feedback was that you guys looked at how does the World Bank hold other countries? How does the World Bank hold other countries accountable? And how does accountability work in the international sense? As if that was more developed than what the EU was able to do, which is kind of the opposite of what we normally hear, which is that the EU can do it in a way that would be impossible internationally because, oh wow, international is just a kind of jungle. But that made me think, and I'm not sure how to take that forward. But
could I just come back on that point, Irene? Yeah, I'm not. I think what the EU was looking at, and well, it wasn't specific, and very specifically within the EU, the Directorate General for Regional and Urban Policy in the Commission, European Commission, was in the 7-yearly bun fight, the traditional question is cohesion policy effective? And the net payers are interested in reducing the EU budget and saying, no, it's not effective. And those who are net beneficiaries are interested in saying, yes, it is effective. And that's quite crude, but essentially that's what it is. And in each round of the negotiations up until the most recent one, up until 2013, the European Commission and particularly DG Regio, the defenders of cohesion policy, were under pressure to show accountability and deliverability of results and defend themselves against allegations of fraud, mismanagement, wasteful spending, ineffective spending. And so what they were casting around for was mechanisms by which they could, on the one hand, respond to the literature and evaluation evidence, which was that there isn't sufficient conditionality on EU spending relative to targets and the objectives that are set out by member states in their programs. And secondly, politically, show to the net payers, oh, look, we are committed to accountability, and here's something that will prove that. And so this is where you get this layering of regulatory obligations over time. And if you look back at retired civil servants who've been involved in these negotiations, some of them will quite freely admit we weren't actually interested in whether cohesion policy works well or not. We were just interested in hammering the budget. Now that is cynical, but so just on your point, Jonathan, I think there's a very, very specific set of, well, there's very specific context within which the learning from conditionalities was sought. Rather than the model as a whole, and it was by certain interests within the Commission.
Interesting.
But those dynamics would absolutely play out in an international aid context as well. So, they are used by those, who wish to increase aid to show that it can be accountable and the structures are there to make it, more transparent and more effective. And then others, would point to, failures in bureaucratic processes, failures to adhere to conditionalities being wavered, and all of that to show that actually none of this has any effect whatsoever, and therefore aid should be reduced. So, you'll get that very much alive and well in the aid community as well, international aid community. Listen, I have to apologize because I have to do the school run, so I literally have to leave in about 1 minute's time. But if Jonathan can stay, then
I will go as well.
Okay.
I think probably everyone does.
But yeah, just wanted to say thank you to you all. And
I'm glad you got particularly a chance to talk to John and Fiona, who are both directors of EPRC and have been involved in the world of cohesion policy for an incredible, I won't humiliate you by saying it's a really long time, but you know what I mean. And yes, sorry to have dipped into the school run. I just had to send my husband on our one as well. So, but thank you very much for your time. And I saw that the links to documents have been sent on, but it'd be good to maybe keep in contact via email and things, because I had a few questions buzzing in my head. So, but thanks very much though for giving up the time to take part in the seminar today, and for everybody who was able to join it as well. So thanks very much. And yeah,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene, and to be continued. Let's hopefully reconvene next year.
No. Thanks very much. See you.
Great, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.